Welcome everybody to the second webinar on international lending and sovereign debt, which is associated with the research and policy network of the same with the same name. Great to see so many of you here. Like last time, we will have Q&A at the end. So Hélène will speak for about 40 minutes. And then we will open it up for Q&A. If you have questions to understand context, you can also raise your hand in between. I am extremely pleased to welcome Hélène Rey as the speaker of today. Thank you so much for taking the time and for being on board. I don't think that Hélène needs much introduction. She is one of the foremost international macroeconomists worldwide. She's a professor at the London Business School, has received a whole range of major prizes, has published in the top journals, is visible in the policy world, in the media, and is vice president of CPR. It goes on and on and on, but I don't want to take too much of your time. It is just absolutely fantastic that you are here, especially since this is a paper that fits very well with the theme of this series. It's a great paper you've co-authored with Silvia, Miranda-Agrippino, and Tsvetelina, Nenova, entitled Global Footprints of Monetary Policies, comparing the spillovers of Chinese and US monetary policies on a global level. So we're very excited to hear you present this paper, and I will hand over to you. Yeah, hopefully you can share the screen. And as I said, we'll have the Q&A in the end.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christophe. Very generous introduction. I hope you can see my screen, right? You can see the slides. Perfect. So I'm very happy to take part in this great seminar series that Christophe is organizing. And I'm going to present indeed some joint work with Silvia and Sveti. And it's very much still work in progress and rather kind of I would say, a research agenda in a way than a finished paper. But I think you're going to get the flavor of it when I go through the presentation, I hope. So here we go, global footprints of monetary policies. As we all know, and this is something that several of us have been working on for a while, we have various different possibilities for international monetary policy transmissions of large central banks, including obviously, and the first among them, the Federal Reserve. But you will see indeed, as Christophe said, that I will touch upon the People's Bank of China this time around. And Silvia and Sveti have also worked on the European central banks. So the international transmission of monetary policy can go through from different channels. We have the standard channels which are described by the classic Mendelian models, where it's mostly about current account balances and exchange rate and international goods market. We also have the global financial cycle, where the transmission channels, what is emphasized there is really the transmission through capital flows, but also risk-taking, so risk measures of risk-taking, risk premia, leverage, asset valuations, and all that. And in that framework, the foreign exchange market plays a role as a shock absorber, but it's only a partial role, hence the kind of dilemma, trilemma style of research. We also have potentially other types of transmission channels, which are a little bit more, in a way, complicated in terms of, because they involve more networks of input-output, so global value chains, for example, that can go through integrated production chains. So this is a lot of different possibility when we think about global footprints and international monetary policy transmissions, and there is no reason to expect that these types of transmissions would be equally important for the different central banks, right? And so this is a little bit what we are going to start exploring here in this paper. Now I'm going to show you a number of nice, I think, graphs which have to do with different views of the world. And I will have quite a few of these network graphs because this is something we are working on and we have different versions of them. So if we think about the trade channel of monetary policy transmission, so when we think more about here, for example, exports, and we look at the world through the lens of international trade linkages. So you can see here that I have a size of the different countries which are proportional to export plus imports. And then the arrows are the exports from one country to the other. And if we look at the world through this lens, we see that the US and China are kind of the big nodes here. But also if you look at the gray nodes, you see these are the European countries. Together, they are roughly of the same size as the US and China. So we have very much a kind of tripolar world if we think about the world as trade linkages. Okay, so that's very much what we see in the trade data. Now, on the other hand, if we look at the world through the lens of portfolio investment, so portfolio investments are investment in debt securities and equity securities. You see here that it looks quite different. So the financial view of the world looks quite different from the trade view of the world, in the sense that we still have the US as a very big node, and here the node as proportional to the portfolio position in debt and equity, the sum of the assets and liability positions, and the arrows are the asset side. Okay, and we see that the US is still a very big node, but you look at China, it's very, very tiny here. And that would probably be different, and this would be a nice also network to plot that I haven't plotted if I had, for example, Christophe data on investment of China in terms of FDI, or and if I were to focus on specific countries, China would be a lot more important, like the Belt and Road country. But so here in portfolio investment, I can see that China is a tiny node in this graph. It's here, in fact, if you can see with my mouse. It's a tiny node. What is big is the US, and you can see that the UK is pretty big as well, and some European countries are also quite big. But among those, as you would expect, you have Luxembourg and Ireland, which are very big because they have a lot of mutual funds and portfolio flows come from these countries. And then you have the offshore financial centers, like the Cayman, like you would find the Bahamas, etc., the Virgin Islands. So it is a very different type of linkage compared to the trade linkages. Now, in this world, so we are going to first take a look at what the US Federal Reserve does, and then we will take a look at the People's Bank of China. So why so much focus on the US Federal Reserve? And this was also the focus on a lot of my previous work. Well, of course, because the US Federal Reserve is issuing the dollar, which is very much at the center of the international financial system. And another way to look at this network graph, so it's another graph here that I have on the financial linkages, which this time also use the IMF CPIF data, so the portfolio data, but uses also the Coppola, Maggiore, Neyman, and Schrager reallocation of flows, which looks through the offshore financial centers. So instead of having, for example, the Cayman Island, they reallocate the kind of true financial flows or ultimate financial flows, if you like, looking through the offshore centers. You see, I mean, it's a relatively similar picture in the sense that the US is still very much in the center of the financial system. China is a little bit bigger once you reallocate those funds, but it's still the case that the US is very much the dominant player here. So that's just confirmed what we saw before, but using this nice work of Antonio Coppola and Matteo Maggiore and co-authors. Okay. Now it's the US is at the center of the financial system. What does it mean? That means many different things, but they probably are all relevant for the international transmission of monetary policy. That means that, for example, the US is a dominant player in foreign exchange reserves, as we can see here it's taken from the ECB report on the international role of the euro. They kind of compare the euro to the US dollar. As you can see, the blue bars tend to be by far the biggest one. So that means the dollar is the most important currency for foreign exchange reserves, for international debt issuance, for international loans, FX turnover, and also as a global payment currency. So the US dollar intervenes in many different levels, whether on the goods market or on the financial side. And therefore, what one can expect that indeed what the Federal Reserve does is an important part of what is playing out in international finance. And it is. I mean, so empirically, we're going to see that indeed this intuition that one may have because of the overwhelming presence of the dollar on all these different markets, you can see it in the effect of the Federal Reserve on a number of outcomes. And we will look at that, and we will also contrast it with the People's Bank of China. So I'll just remind you here that there is a very nice literature on the dominance of the US dollar on very different level. I think Ken Rogoff was the speaker last time, and he has done some very nice work on exchange rate regime with Ethan Ilzeski and Reinhard Rogoff, classification, etc. Gita Gopinath has done a lot of work also on the trade side of things. And again, Matteo and Brent Neyman and JC Schrager have done very nice work on denomination of bonds in portfolios. So all that, then there's all the literature on reserve currency with Barash and Green, etc. All this stuff shows that the dollar is really the main player in all these dimensions. Now, this translates into the existence of a global financial cycle that I will characterize first. I will show you in the data what that means, but essentially it's going to be about global co-movements of financial variables and an important role for the Federal Reserve in driving those co-movements. So these financial variables are going to be affected by monetary loosening or tightening of whatever Jay Powell will do or is doing. And this is, I think, a manifestation of an important channel of monetary policy, which maybe has not been as studied as a lot of other channels of monetary policy, which is the risk-taking channel. And the fact that US monetary policy moves risk premia, it moves spreads. And this is something that is not in the traditional neo-Keynesian models of monetary policy. You need some financial friction in order to get this type of things. But I believe this is something that is quite important to explain what is happening in this international data. Okay, so I'm not going to speak more about this literature here. There's a lot and it's very active. And so there's a lot more work in these areas. So I'm going to be presenting to you again some facts about the global financial cycle and the effect of the Fed, and then I will move on to the People's Bank of China. So let's take a look again at the global factors, the global financial cycle, and I will go beyond actually the global financial cycle, and I will build here on some work with Silvia that is in the Handbook of International Economics to introduce some new stylized facts. Then I will look at the transmission channel of the Fed mainly, and then the Chinese monetary policy. That's what I'm going to do now in the next 35 minutes. Okay, so the global financial cycle. We start from a common empirical framework here for both asset prices and for capital flows. And what we do is that we take big panels of financial variables. So it can be asset prices, it can be various types of different flows in different types of assets. So that's going to be the YJT, as big a panel as feasible. And we are going to fit global factors to this data. We're going to test for the number of global factors, and we're also allowing for regional factors, or we can allow for sectoral specific factors. And then we have also some idiosyncratic shocks. So it's a dynamic factor model, and we build on the work of these authors here, including my colleague Lucrezia Reichlin, to estimate these dynamic factor models. Now, what do we put in our panel? Well, everything that is available, essentially. So for risk asset prices, we are going to go to equity, to commodities, to corporate bonds. We have a panel which is monthly from the 1980s to 2020, essentially, with a large cross-section. And for capital flows, so there we have to go to quarterly data because that's what is available from the balance of payment data. And we have portfolio equity, debt, trade credit, and banking flows, and FDI. Okay, so when we construct these panels, so we have one panel for asset prices, and then we have one panel for capital flows. What we can see is that in the asset price data, essentially there is one global factor. So when we test for the presence of a number of global factors, we find one for asset prices, and we find two for capital flows. Okay, so this is based on the honesty test, so you can believe me. So there is one global factor in asset prices and two in capital flows. The global factor in asset prices explains about a quarter of the variance of the data, and the one in capital flows explains about, together, 35% of the variance. So this is quite big for very broad cross sections. So the question now is, what do these global factors actually look like? So 25% of the variance, that means global risky asset prices do co-move quite a bit, okay? And the global factor in asset prices looks like that. So we have updated it compared to our Review of Economic Studies paper in 2015. And we have now this dark blue line, which shows you the global factor in risky asset prices, and it behaves a little bit in the way you would expect, which is that in particular in recession, US recessions here, the shaded areas, you see that it goes down quite a bit. It goes massively down during the global financial crisis. It went up quite a bit during the pre-crisis period between 2003 and 2007, and then collapsed. And it has remained a little bit subdued with some cycle ever since. So that's the global factor in risky asset prices. Now, what is interesting about this global factor in risky asset prices is that it's negatively correlated with indices of risk aversions. So it is here, I plotted here, the dark blue is the global factor in asset price with the VIX or the V-stocks, or you can take lots of risk aversion indices which have been computed in the literature. So here, these are various papers of Gerd Beckert and co-authors, and they tend to co-move negatively. So when risky asset prices go up, these indices of risk aversion and uncertainty, these VIX, etc., they tend to go down. Okay, so that's the correlation. It's a negative co-movement between this kind of risk-taking in risk aversion indices and the global factor in asset prices. And this is quite general across the type of indices that we have, whether they are traded instruments or whether they have been estimated by researchers. Okay, so what about the capital flow data? And the capital flow data, I told you that there was two global factors. So I'm going to show you first the first one. And what is amazing when you look at this data is that the global factor in risky asset prices and the first global factor in capital flows co-move very strongly. The correlation is about 80%. So here you have my first global factor in asset prices, the blue line, and you have the global factor in capital flow, the first one. You see that it's very much co-moving together. So it seems like volumes and prices, you know, for once in economics, usually you have price goes up, kind of volume tends to go down. So here, no, it's prices and volumes here globally, they kind of co-move together. So they represent some kind of financial activity variable or some kind of co-movement in global transactions and valuations of assets. They tend to go together. And what is also quite interesting is that if we look at inflows and outflows, so what goes into a country and what comes out of a country, they also co-move together. So it's really a financial intermediation activity variable, what we are picking up here. Valuation go up, financial activity goes up, this shows up in inflows and this shows up in outflows. Everybody is kind of co-moving. This is done here for total inflows and outflows, but I can look at different types of capital flows because I have portfolio flows, I have FDI, and I have banking flows, essentially, that's over inflows, for example. And you see that they tend all to co-move, right? So here, I've just, I've put this one upside down because it's an outflow, but really you can put it the other way. There's a minus sign in front of everything here. You see that everything is co-moving. Well, FDI is a little bit smoother, maybe. So the correlations are a little bit less strong, but everything tends to be co-moving across inflows and outflows and across different asset types. So if we do a brief summary at this point of what we have so far, we have a number of stylized facts which are pretty strong. One, that there is one global factor in risk asset prices, which explains about 25% of the variance of a broad panel of asset prices. It correlates quite strongly positively with risk appetite or negatively with risk aversions, like indices such as the VIX. Then we have two factors in capital flows. The first one co-moves very much with a factor in risky asset prices. Together with two factors explain approximately 1/3 of the variance of the data. So this kind of first factor in capital flows and the risky asset price factor characterizes some kind of global financial activity. Okay, so the global financial cycle. We see that within capital flows, we have co-movements in essentially inflows, outflows, and across asset classes, also across asset classes. I see that there was some clarification question about whether the network graphs were pre or post-COVID. They are pre-COVID. Okay, so they are with data, I think, 2019, and of course they can be updated. And it's something interesting to do. Yeah, and we'll see there are some more. So there's some question on climate change. I think I'm going to pass on that one for the moment, and we can maybe see at the end whether, because this is a bit of a different topic, so I don't want to get too much derailed at this stage, but we can talk about it later. Okay, so what's behind the factors? Well, so here I don't think we have a total consensus on what's behind these co-movements. I mean, I have some view about what may create this type of global financial cycle and how things may work. So this common component, as we have seen, is correlated with these indices of risk aversion, such as the VIX, etc. And so I have some theoretical work with Nuno Coimbra, where we model financial cycles with heterogeneous intermediaries. And the idea is very much that at different points in time, there are different financial players which are dominant in the markets. And these different financial players have different degrees of risk aversion. So if at some point in time you have very risk-taking people who dominate the market, then valuations are very high. There is a lot of leverage, so a lot of volume of transactions in international financial markets. While if at other times, maybe because there has been a crisis, the people who remain in the market are much more regulated, much more risk-averse, then valuations are much lower, and there's a lot less leverage and a lot less international financial flows. So these type of models, where you have time variation in who is in the market and asymmetry in risk aversions across the different players. Some are very risk-taking, others are less risk-taking, maybe because of regulation, maybe some are banks, some can leverage, others cannot leverage, etc. I think has the potential to explain this type of patterns, and this is the type of explanation that we explore with Nuno in this paper on financial cycles with heterogeneous intermediaries. Just to give you a little bit of flavor, you remember the shape of a global financial cycle. Well, if we look at the type of flows during that period, who is essentially dominating the market, you see that when asset valuations are very high and there is a lot of global financial activity, the banks here in between 2003 and 2007, the global banks were extremely active in international financial flows, and they were loosely regulated. Okay, so there was a lot of leverage in that sector, a lot of risk-taking. After the global financial crisis, the banks become a lot less important in international financial flows. So that just an example of a change in the compositions of who is in the market and how that may be related to valuation and to international financial transaction. It's just one possibility, okay? But I think that's an interesting one to follow up upon. And this is linked to some work that in particular Yun Shin and Valentina Bruno also have been pursuing, looking at leverage of global banks and how that affects risk-taking, how risk-taking may change over time, etc. So this is very much related to that research agenda. Okay, but we had a second global factor in capital flows. What was it? Well, here it is. It looks completely different. That's a factor in global capital flow, the dark line here, which is very closely related to commodity price movements. I've put also the oil price. We can see that there is a clear correlation, and this is something that was also noticed by first by Erik van Winkoop and his co-authors in a paper in the GIE. So that second global factor is an entirely different animal and correlates with commodity markets. It also correlates with, as we will see, with global trade. And here, what we have is also global, it's a private sector liquidity measure, which correlates with liquidity creation by banks, but also by non-banks on the private sector side. So this is the second factor in global capital flow, so quite different from the first one. And I'm putting here a table with all the correlations across various variables that I've talked about. So we see that the factor in asset price correlates strongly with the first factor in capital flow. That's what we have here, and not as strongly with the second factor in capital flow. On the other hand, we see that the second factor in capital flows correlate with liquidity, but also correlate very strongly with the oil price, commodity price, world output, various measures, world trade, world private liquidity. So that's very interesting. It also correlates negatively, strongly with the dollar exchange rate. And on the other hand, we've seen the first factor in the global factor in asset price correlates negatively with risk-taking, and so does the first factor in capital flows. Okay, so that's an interesting pattern of correlations, which I think a theoretical model should think about in international finance. Okay, so summary for this second part, we have the second factor in capital flow. It correlates strongly with trade, with commodities, with private liquidity. So there seems to be on top of the global financial cycle, which was asset prices and the first factor in capital flows, a second global cycle, which is a global trade and commodity cycle. And it correlates with the second factor in capital flows. All right, so now that we have the stylized facts, let's take a look at Federal Reserve. Let's take a look at the People's Bank of China. And the rationale for the Federal Reserve, the effect of the Federal Reserve on the global financial cycle, I've given it. The dollar is at the center of international monetary system. And from my network graphs, you can also guess the rationale for looking at the People's Bank of China. China was very important also in the trade network. And we also have some evidence that China seems important also for commodity market. And we've seen that the second global factor is linked to commodity prices. So that's why we are going to zero in now on these two central banks. So we are going to estimate a VAR for the US vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So we call that here a global VAR, but it's incorrect. it's really a bilateral VAR. It's the US vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And it is in our research agenda to estimate a proper global VAR, which is a VAR where you take into account all the countries as a network. So the type of networks that I've shown you, we can actually incorporate it in VAR analysis via running a proper global VAR. But that's not what we are doing for the moment. This is work in progress, the global VAR. Right now, we are doing US vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So we are going to run a monthly VAR. We are going to put together real variables and financial variables. We'll do the same for China. And we're going to identify US monetary policy shock via the high frequency IV methodology that has been widely used by now, put forward by many people and used recently by Gettler and Karady, and by Silvia and Giovanni also in some work, and that Silvia and I have used also in our review of economic studies paper. So this identification, I think it's the most reliable identification of monetary policy shocks that we have currently. It's about essentially looking at a window around monetary policy announcement and looking at the surprise in Fed funds future that occurred during that window of 30 minutes. So there's only monetary policy announcement that happened during that window. So we are fairly sure that we are identifying a monetary policy shock. So that's the principle of this type of identification. And it's quite precise, and it gives you the effect of monetary policy on the other variables. So what are those other variables? We are going to have industrial production, CPI. We are instrumenting the one-year rate. We are going to have the exchange rate. Then we are going to look at the global factors, the real variables, and financial condition indexes, commodities, the VIX, and capital flows and outflows. So we're going to look at all this. So I'm showing you some results for the US here. And you can see that, so we are instrumenting the 1 year. So the 1 year, that's a 100 basis point shock, okay, to the one-year rate. What do we notice for the US? Well, we notice some important effects on, for example, the dollar exchange rate. We have an appreciation of the dollar essentially on impact. We have some effect on US variables, as you would expect. So on the inflation in the US, the consumer price and industrial production. But maybe what is more important for us is what happens to the global financial cycle variables. And what happens to the global financial cycle variables is very strong. You see that the World Financial Condition Index, when the US monetary policy tightens, plunges essentially. World private liquidity plunges as well, goes down. The global factor in asset price, which is, a kind of index for our global financial cycle, goes down very strongly. So does the first factor in capital flows, okay, that you can see here. So we see that the financial conditions, the VIX goes up. So we see that all the indices of financial conditions are very strongly affected by a tightening of the US Federal Reserve. That's what we see here when we run this VAR. But that's not the only thing that we can see. So, okay, I could also have a look at that. We do have also an effect on the commodity price index. Okay, so the Fed does have an effect on world trade and on commodity price indices. And we will remember that when we will look at the effect of the People's Bank of China on these variables. Okay, so do all the countries respond in the same way? So here we cannot answer this question with this VAR, but there has been a lot of interesting additional work. So there's De Gasperi, Hong, and Rico, in fact, and there's Corsetti, Custer, Miller, and Schmidt, who have also looked at these things. And there are some variations. Some of it depends on the foreign exchange rate regime. There's sometimes some partial cushioning of these effects via foreign exchange, but still some transmission. So there is a lot of interesting work on all these issues, and I'm not going to get into it now. However, what we see here in our bilateral VAR, when we look at emerging markets versus advanced economies, or here that's emerging market versus simply inflows and outflows into the US and from the US, So these are IRF impulse responses taken from my VAR, my big VAR, and here this is just zooming on these variables. What is interesting is that when there is a tightening, we see that both inflows and outflows from the US go down, or into the US go down, and this is going to be true for advanced economies usually. That's the type of pattern we have, so a decrease in financial activity. However, if you look at emerging markets, it's kind of asymmetric. Inflows go down, outflows go up. So in net, we have capital leaving emerging markets after a tightening. Okay, so there's some asymmetry of transmission between advanced and emerging markets. Now, what about the People's Bank of China? As we have noted before, we don't have only a global financial cycle, we also have the global trade and commodity cycle, okay, which is linked to the second factor in global capital flows. And there, we might conjecture that China is an important player, given that when we look, again, it's another version of a network with trade network here. China, the US, and the euro area, this time it's aggregated, you see they are more or less similar, okay? And so here I'm not focusing on the ECB, but Tsvetelina and Silvia have a nice paper on this, and they do find that the ECB has a sizable effect on trade and commodity cycles. So here I'm looking at this one, the People's Bank of China. So we might conjecture that it does have an effect, given at its importance in this network. So we are going to try to estimate another kind of global, in the sense of bilateral VAR, China vis-a-vis the rest of the world, using as similar a methodology as we can compared to what I've just shown you for the US. So for that, we need to have first a way of identifying Chinese monetary policy, and then we have to use similar variables as the ones that we had when we looked at the transmission of the Fed. So now we are looking at the footprints of the People's Bank of China, okay, and the estimation sample is smaller than what we had for the US. And the other thing is that it's a little bit harder to properly measure the monetary policy of the People's Bank of China, and it's going to be a little bit harder also to identify a monetary policy shock. So the People's Bank of China's monetary policy is multidimensional and the instruments have changed a little bit over time. So we are guided by some narrative here of people who have looked at the People's Bank of China monetary policy. The People's Bank of China has used both volume instruments, so bank loans quota, but also different types of interest rates, has looked at M2 growth. It has used there's the Shibor, there's the interbank repo rate, the 7 days interest rate is important. So there is a bit of variation. And the objectives of the People's Bank of China include inflation, growth, employment, also balance of payment objectives, so the exchange rate. So it's not as clear-cut as the Federal Fed's funds rate, okay? But nevertheless, so we are guided by this narrative, and we are taking the monetary policy indicator that has been constructed according to this narrative by Xu and Jia, and we are going to use their monetary policy index. We are still in the process of trying to find the equivalent of Fed funds futures for China, which, as you will see in a minute, there's some kind of equivalent. So we are going to use that eventually, but for the moment, we didn't have this data. So what we did is essentially a kind of old-style type of identification of a monetary policy shock, assuming that the real variables are not reacting immediately. So it's a timing assumption, but it's not a timing assumption which is as clear-cut as when we use high-frequency futures. Okay, so our identification for the moment is not as clear-cut as what we could do with the Fed funds future. We hope we're going to get there for China, but for the moment, we assume more kind of a more old-style timing assumption where financial variables can move right away, but the real variables cannot move right away. And we use this monetary policy indicator, which is a composite of all these different instruments that I have been describing. You can see some of the most important ones are here, and the monetary policy indicator that we use is the dark line. Okay. So we discovered recently that there is actually potentially some possibility to do high frequency identification. So we're still working on that. There's this interesting paper of Camber and Mohanty here from the BIS. And we started to construct the surprise of monetary policy surprise of the banks of China based on this indicator. But for the moment, there's still some predictability in the surprises. So some more work is needed. So I'm not going to spend time on what we have for the moment. I'm just going to show you the results with the first type of identification, which is based on the monetary policy indicator and the kind of timing assumptions. Okay, so what do we find for the People's Banks of China? Here we go. So we do a very similar exercise as for the US, but the results, as you can see here, are quite different. So first of all, if we look at Chinese variable, so we do find an effect on industrial production in China, an effect of consumer prices. That's the Chinese monetary policy index. Again, here it's a pretty large shock that we consider because it's an index. And what we find is an effect on the RMB exchange rate. So we do find, which is an appreciation on the RMB. So we do find things that make sense from the point of view of Chinese variable. But what about from the point of view of international variable? Okay, so when we look at world financial conditions, or when we look at the VIX, or when we look at the factor in capital flows, or the factor in asset prices, we don't find much here. So you see, there's nothing that is very significant. Certainly, it goes all over the place and is close to zero, whenever we look at the VIX. So it's very different from what we had for the Federal Reserve monetary policy tightening. We don't seem to find here any significant effect on global financial condition. On the other hand, when we look at variables such as world trade or the commodity price index, this looks quite strong, the response, especially from the commodity price index. Actually, the response is much stronger than the response to the Fed tightening. So the People's Bank of China seems to have a rather large effect on trade and commodity prices, and also some effect on world production. Okay, so that's quite different in terms of the type of responses that we get compared to the Federal Reserve. And here, what we also looked at is the effect of the Federal Reserve, more specifically on commodity producers. And we see that private liquidity in commodity producing country, inflows to commodity producers, outflows from commodity producers react to the People's Bank of China. Okay, so the People's Bank of China does seem to have an effect on commodity markets and also on inflows and outflows to commodity producers quite strongly, and on trade, but no effect on the global financial cycle, on world financial conditions. Okay. So now another interesting property of the People's Bank of China's monetary policy is that if we look at some specific countries, and here we pick Germany, because in the network, we can see that there are strong links between Germany and China. What we find is that the People's Bank of China monetary policy does seem to have a strong effect on imports and exports to Germany and industrial production in Germany. So that's kind of interesting, and that seems to go through most likely trade and industrial production. So that's a different type of linkage than the financial linkages that we have seen with the Federal Reserve. So I'm, I think, out of time. So I'm going to conclude here. I think so. What I've tried to show you so far is that we have interesting stylized facts in terms of global financial cycle and also global trade and commodity cycles. So I've characterized these different types of cycles. And what we find is that the Federal Reserve monetary policy tends to have strong effect on the global financial cycle. It also has some effect on global trade and commodity cycle. But if we look at the People's Bank of China monetary policy, and okay, we still have to do quite a lot of robustness check. As I showed you, we need to do a better job potentially at identifying the People's Bank of China monetary policy and have some different ways of doing it. But so far what we find is no effect essentially on the global financial cycle, strong effect on the global trade and commodity cycle, including on the industrial production and trade of some industrial countries, such as Germany. In another paper, so not here, Tsvetelina and Silvia find that for the euro area, and this is something also that some people at the ECB here, which are all cited, Cazorzi, Dedola, Georgiadis, Jawozinski, Straka, and Tresser find, is that the ECB has an effect also on trade and commodity markets. And Silvia and Tsvetelina find that on top of that, the ECB tend to have an effect on global financial cycle, but mostly during the quantitative easing period, after the zero lower bound. This effect is not as strong as the Fed, though. So the ECB is kind of in between the People's Bank of China and the Federal Reserve. Now, there are interesting asymmetries in terms of the exposure of emerging markets and commodity producers to both central banks, to the Federal Reserve and to the People's Bank of China, that should be explored further. And what we are set to doing now is exploiting more of this network structure that I've been showing you by estimating proper global VER, which will take into account of these different linkages and which would enable us to do some counterfactual exercises. When the network changes, how do the impulse responses to the different monetary policy change? So this is some type of exercise that can be done via global VER, and there's some interesting work on global VER that have been done by a number of authors here. So why do we think it is super interesting? Because this thing changes a lot. So here, these networks change a lot. This is the trade networks between 2000 and 2019. You see that between 2000 and 2019, one thing that has happened is China, okay, in terms of importance in the global trade linkages. And when we look at portfolio finance, and EMU is the euro area, etc., we see that between 2000 and 2000, so here it's 2018, what do we have? Well, EMU is still is very important. It was already important in 2000, but China is still not super important. Okay, so that's kind of interesting, but these things change over time, and obviously with geopolitics, they may change even more. And so this type of methodology, hopefully, will enable us to look at those issues. So let me stop here, and I hope I was not too long.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the great presentation. Many avenues, and as you said, it looks like a research agenda with many potential important applications, including the last one, which I also find fascinating. But let me open the floor to the Q&A. I have questions, but let's have the audience ask. If I understand correctly, you can also actually come in by video and speak by raising your hand. I think Elise will coordinate this.
So there was a question in the chat on global factors and climate change. This doesn't, there's no climate dimension to any of these measures. So climate or flows related to climate change in terms of, I don't know, maybe transition, energy transition, etc. That would be a totally different type of paper, and really I cannot speak to that with this work. This is traditional international finance and trade measures.
Hi, Hélène. Hi, Christophe. Good to see you guys. Yeah, so I was wondering, you know, for the trade data, especially if you look at China, there's a huge difference between headline import-export numbers and the value-added numbers. And so I was wondering, if you're overestimating the trade, you might be underestimating its effects. So I was wondering if you had a look at the value added. There are good numbers for that from ADBI, as well as the, I think, WTO by now, and the IMF.
Yes, so definitely. So we started to experiment with different trade data, and this is definitely something we are going to do more of. We also we're doing some network based on value added versus based on growth numbers for export and imports, and it does change some potentially the magnitude of some effects. So you're totally right, and I guess that indeed that I mean, I don't know. I mean, exactly over time, I think there has been some change in the type of or the amount of value added that has been going through China. So I think that there could be interesting variation between the entry of China in the WTO and now, actually. So this is something that we can definitely refine and go and talk about at more length once we do the proper global VAR with the networks. I think we will look at these type of things. And there's also the production networks, which with some input-output values. So yes, so there are lots of different variations that we can use for the values of the networks, and this will be time varying and have some implication for the magnitude of the effects. So it's exactly the type of thing we're interested in. So that's a very, very good suggestion. Did I answer, Galina?
Yeah, no, yeah, I didn't even think about the variation of that, but you're exactly right. I don't know if you can get value added data to prior to WTO accession, though.
No, I mean, but really at the beginning versus now, I think there's really quite a bit of variation, but I don't know what is available exactly, and whether the network would be very small. I don't know. Mm-hmm. So that's something to explore for sure.
No, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karina. There's one question by Chiara Banti here. I would like to ask whether you gave any attention to the regional factors as well as the global, especially in the context of the supposed trend towards fragmentation.
So no, not so far. So far, we have only looked at the global factors, and there's clearly an interesting things to do with by looking in more detail at the regional factors. So in our paper in the review of economic studies with Silvia, we reported the regional factors. So what they look like, if I remember well, but we didn't do any analysis with them. So we only did some analysis with the global factors in the VARs in particular. So this is also something that, some more work could be done on that. Another way to think about these regional dimensions will be when if we manage to do this global VAR that are on our research agenda, will be to change the structure of the networks. And for example, to look at what we mean if we think the world is getting more fragmented, maybe for geopolitical reasons, if we believe that there's going to be some more, friendshoring or reshoring, or so if we can change exogenously the structure of a network and then see how this affects the transmission of shocks. So that would be another way at looking at regional fragmentation, which would be different from looking at the regional factor extracted from the dynamic factor models. So this is something that we plan to do because we're quite interested in the interaction between geopolitics and international finance. Something I think that also the people at the Kiel Institute are quite interested in. So that would be another way of looking at that. So all very good suggestion. I see there's quite a bit actually in the.
Yeah, there is one question on Africa, how you could look at the spillovers. And let me piggyback on that one because it was related to a question I also had. Like the impact of China in these peripheral, like South countries is massive. So decisions on investments and commodity prices have driven much of the boom there. So I was wondering whether you could maybe add, I don't know, yields from African countries or emerging market countries as one more vehicle, or in general, how you could assess this massive impact on those countries, which are, of course, have the usual problem of data quality and scarcity.
Yes.
But maybe yields would be one.
No, definitely. So this is something I would be extremely interested in exploring further. But I don't know if for this thing the methodology of the VARs would be feasible, because we do need long time series to estimate these VARs, and so usually we don't have this type of time series for a number of countries. So that's an issue. So for that, there may be more panel style data, more disaggregated data. I don't know, firm level data even could be more interesting to explore. And another thing is that all my network I've been showing for financial linkages are based on portfolio investment, and portfolio investment are probably not the most important vehicle for Chinese investment in African countries. So we would need to have more data, specific data on foreign direct investment. And again, I think maybe the way to do that would be to go to firm level and to have more granular data, which would be shorter as well, but maybe we would have some identification more for cross-sectional variation as well as time series, because that would not fly this methodology otherwise. So I think it's super interesting, but I don't think it can be tackled in the same way as what I've been showing today, essentially. But that would be great, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I can see that. There's one question by Udabir Das from the IMF for Noel. Hello, Udabir. From a policy angle, what is the main lesson for central bankers from your research, and implications for how the international monetary system functions today and would benefit from some adjustment?
Aha. So there are some for the global financial cycle. So there are plenty of implications that have already starting to be explored, actually, including at the IMF, but also in other international organizations of central banks. So one of the big implications of this type of work is the transmission of financial conditions of the Federal Reserve, essentially. So a Federal Reserve tightening or loosening has an effect on valuations, on spreads, on leverage, which go well beyond the US borders. So this matters for both for monetary policy conditions in emerging markets, but also in advanced economies, and also for financial stability. And we have repeatedly seen in the past that capital inflows, which seem to react quite strongly to the Federal Reserve, may have some destabilizing effect on emerging markets in particular, but not only. So this brings the whole debate about both capital flow management, but also macroprudential policies really to the forefront. And so I think one of the effects of this research has been to underline the fact that even with floating exchange rates are not the same thing as fixed exchange rates. So there are lots of different properties, and floating exchange rates are useful in many ways. But they are not enough to fully insulate a country from this type from the global financial cycle, from this type of tightening or loosening of the Federal Reserve. And so this research, I think, has brought to the forefront the need to really work with these additional tools, the macroprudential tools in particular. And people have been experimenting a lot more with those tools. And there's now also a whole bunch of papers which I cited in my slides, which look at whether macroprudential tools work ex ante, how they can be creating some more monetary policy space, for example, for emerging markets, how they can be beneficial for financial stability, stabilize the capital flow pattern, for example, of financial markets. So all these things, I think, are very important for macroeconomic stabilization in emerging markets, but also it turns out advanced economies are not immune to those influence as well. And so for advanced economies, we also, have to relearn macroprudential stability in a way. And now we have created since the 2010, 2014 in Europe, we have created macroprudential authorities who are precisely trying to do that. I mean, to use additional tools to complement monetary policy, to prevent monetary conditions or financial conditions to be out of line with what would guarantee financial stability. So I think that's a very big implication of this type of research, which is already playing out in the policy world. Now on the People's Bank of China side, I haven't thought as much. And what that means, this effect on the commodity cycle and on the trade cycle. So this is something, I will need to think a little bit more about it.
I think that also answers Barry Herman's point. He also wanted to ask about the implications for the policy fora, which I think you very nicely addressed. There are a couple of more technical points, like why you wouldn't use the ECB financial conditions index, how exactly you define the global financial cycle. So if you want to,
So the ECB financial condition index, I mean, I would be happy to use any kind of financial condition index. Usually, so they tend to co-move quite a bit with one another. I'm happy to put in, in VARs or to correlate with the global financial cycle any financial condition index that exists. So it's just, availability or me not having seen it or not having the data or not, but there's no there's no intention there not using it. So I'm happy to use it. What was the other question?
The definition of a global financial.
Yes, the definition of a global
from normal fluctuations.
Yes, so the definition of a global financial cycle. So it's effectively I defined it in my paper, my 2013 paper written for Jackson Hole. It's the co-movement of global financial variables. So that has to do with capital flows, with asset prices, with leverage. And I think a very nice measure of a global financial cycle are the two global factors that I've shown you here. So the global factor in risky asset prices and the first global factor in capital flows, which co-move quite a lot. And that would be a nice way to visualize the global financial cycle.
Great. I think we have can take two more. There's one question by Christian Friedrich. If there is significant role for trade-driven cycle in capital flows, would that suggest that policymakers should consider trade policies as tools to manage this cycle? Thanks.
Well, so not all capital flows are destabilizing. So it's not because capital is flowing across borders that it's necessary that it's a bad thing. The global financial cycle having to do mostly, I believe, but this is, I mean, to be debated, but I believe having to do mostly with risk-taking in financial markets and leverage of certain type of intermediaries and sometimes capital that flow in and out at high frequency is the type of financial flows that probably needs to be managed and that is managed by macroprudential measures of the type that I described before. So when there is a lot of liquidity and liquidity, for example, because the Fed changed its monetary policy, or there are changes in sentiment in international financial markets, so this risk-taking channel may be quite strong and may be destabilizing. So this is the type of capital flows that one has to keep an eye on and possibly deal with macroprudential policies, or in some cases capital flow management tools, even though there are lots of criticisms about those tools. Flows which are more associated with trade, I mean, it depends. So if you're talking about trade credit or things like that, so these are flows that that are endogenous to the international transaction that are taking place, and then you want to do with international transactions? Well, I guess usually we think of international trade as having a lot of welfare benefits in economics. So this is a different type of fish, right? So it really depends what the capital flow is there for and what it is endogenously associated with. So we have to be a bit careful about the drivers here when we think about those issues.
Great. I can't resist but ask one more question related to Germany, of course. So I was intrigued by your finding there. Because there's, of course, major concerns at the moment, what consequences decoupling from China would have for Germany in particular, because we're more exposed than many of the other European economies. And that your finding goes right down that alley. And I was wondering whether, I don't know if this is a way, a framework to do it, but I was wondering whether that is, how much of that is related to the FDI, high FDI exposures, that many of the profits Germany makes are actually coming from China, and how much is actually exports and imports, or potentially commodity prices. So could you, I don't know if this is a framework again, but I think there would be a big interest, at least here, to understand exactly those channels and maybe use monetary policy as or these various measures of monetary policy to disentangle those effects. Is more of a suggestion, but
yes,
that's definitely super interesting.
I fully agree with you, Christophe. And right now, so we don't know the precise mechanism, and I would be extremely interested in finding out more. And one way I've been starting to work a little bit on that and to start to try to disentangle a bit more of that is precisely by going at the firm level. And try to look at the characteristics of the effect of Chinese monetary policy on different firms, trying to then look at their exposure either via Chinese ownership or via trade links with China or some kind of finance linkages to the extent they can be measured and things like that. So there the issue is mainly with the frequency of the data you can have on firms. So that's not so easy to have strong identification of this effect of the People's Bank of China, but I'm working on that. I think it's super interesting, and it's also super interesting across different countries, right? So look at it for Germany, can look at it for Italy, for Spain, for France, wow. and possibly have some more insight. But the frequency of the data is an issue.
You just caused another 3 emails from me in 1 year inviting you again. Exactly.
Well, we require a lot of time.
Yeah. Great. No, that sounds very, very promising. Wonderful. Okay, I guess we can wrap it up. We're already over time. And yeah, thanks everybody for the very active discussion. And thanks especially Hélène for presenting a very nice paper and also for a great discussion. This was fun. And yeah, thanks again for the time.
Thanks a lot to everyone. It was great questions and great discussion, and to Christophe. Thanks a lot.
Great. Bye, everybody.
Bye.